Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
All right. How are we all doing today? Good. Can you all hear me down here? Can y'all hear me up there? Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, my name is Talon Silverhorn. This is the American Indian Live series. Now, this program happens here at the Coffee House stage every day, Sunday through Wednesday at 4 o'clock. So if you come back here tomorrow or the next day, what is today? Tuesday? So if you come back here tomorrow, then you will see a different program, hopefully with a different presenter, right, over a different topic. So some days you might come and you might learn a little bit about the Brafferton Indian School here in Williamsburg and what's going on there. You might learn about populations through colonization and how they change and what influences them. You might learn about citizenship to different native nations and how that functions. But today what we're going to be talking a little bit about for the next 35 minutes or so is going to be a little bit about sort of the common knowledge. I haven't really come up with a really solid way of phrasing that yet, but the common knowledge, the things that everybody kind of says, oh yeah, everybody knows that, right? Usually the things that are accommodated with a shrug, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And we're going to talk about how some of these things came about, a little bit of a brief introduction to the evolution of misunderstandings as they kind of come from the 18th century all the way up to our present day. But more importantly, I want to know what it is you want to know, right? So we're going to have some time at the end of this, after I get done blabbering, for some questions and some answers, right? So as I'm talking, please be thinking of some good questions that I can try and answer after I get done talking a little bit. But without any further ado, introduce myself in my own language as best as I can, in the Shawnee language. And I have been back home this last week, just this last week for our green corn ceremonies. So I am nice and full up and have been speaking my language all week with folks. And so a little bit of that language right now for you to hear. In my language, I would say, Nikia Carrie Silverhorn, Tenuta Clint Silverhorn, to Kokuchi, Teresa Peacock, to Soma Lance Silverhorn. Did y'all get all that? Alright, cool. So, I'm going to tell you what I said here in just a minute, but real quick I want to talk to you about this place here in Williamsburg, right? So, how many of you are not from Williamsburg? Okay. Who's furthest away? Let's try that. What do you think? Germany. Okay, you win. So we got Germany. Anybody beat Germany? So as we're talking about this place right here, coming to visit Colonial Williamsburg, buy your ticket, walk around, sweat, right? Sit and endure the Virginia heat, hopefully learn something. How many of you have learned something new here today or on your visit? What's one thing you've learned so far?
I learned that shoemakers are different from cobblers. Created in the 18th century.
Yeah, that throws something at you if you call them a cobbler. Yep, so shoemakers are different from cobblers. There's a lot to learn here. There's 301 acres, 88 original buildings, almost 300 buildings here in this museum. But that's what this place is, right? It's a museum. It's a hot, sweaty, mosquito-infested museum, right? So as you're kind of walking around today, looking for things to learn, looking for new things, looking at cool things, looking at the blacksmiths, or going down to the Capitol, or taking tours over at the palace, right? Maybe you've come and found this. How many of you have talked to myself or Cody or Martin at some point in the day-to-day? I remember some of you, right? There's a new thing, right? And so as you're kind of walking around, right, if you run into people, like the Marquis de Lafayette, or run into George Washington, or run into that Scottish guy up there at the gate, right? Run into, say, maybe Patrick Henry sitting on the porch of the Raleigh Tavern. Maybe you run into Jupiter, or Molly, or any of the other enslaved folks here in Williamsburg, right? Is that actually George Washington? He looked pretty good for his age, right? So as you're walking around, you might run into some of those folks. And I say, I am George Washington. I am Patrick Henry. I am Thomas Jefferson. I am the Marquis de Lafayette, right? And it's 1774. It's 1776. It's 1783, right? But when you come and talk to myself, or Cody, or Martin, or Chris, over in the carriage house, or maybe walking up and down the street, or over at the encampment site here, we say hello, and we tell you that we're Martin, and Cody, and Talon, and Chris, and it's 2021, right? So, when we talk to people that come from all over the place, all over the country, all over the world, there are a lot of things. In the regular course of our day, these people that sit out and they kind of click and they count how many people we talk to, right? I talk to about 400, 500 people a day on average, right? So we get a very good sense, and I've been here for about 4.5 years now. Get a very good sense of average, right? You hear the same questions day in and day out. Sometimes people will throw us for a loop, but that's rare now, right? And so when we think about kind of all of these questions that we get, right off the bat, things like, what are you doing here? What is this place? What do you have to tell me? Or what are you wearing? Are you wearing pants? If not, why? You know, all these other kind of things like that. But then when we get past that wall of not in character, I'm an actual native person, right? Because that's that kind of line right there. Inevitably we come to this question of, well, are you, are you actually, and we have to say, yes, absolutely. I'm a citizen of a federally recognized tribe. I grew up on a reservation in Oklahoma. I'm happy to tell you anything that you want to know, right? And then it's like this weight has been taken off their shoulders. And now they can ask all these other questions. So, well, where did you come from? How did you come to be here? Why did you want to work here at Williamsburg? Do you speak your language? Did you grow up on a reservation? Do you go to the grocery store? Do you know what a cell phone is? Do you live in a house? Do you drive a car? And so these kinds of questions like that point to a very large disconnect between ourselves as Native folks living here and our neighbors here in the United States, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how that gap came to be, and we're going to talk about the types of things that it introduces into conversations, or lack of conversations. So, how many of you went through public school? We're going to start there, right? Because that's where a lot of people's first introduction to Native folks is, right? So if you went through public school, tell me if this sounds familiar, right? That first, open up that cover of American history, right? Flip those couple of title pages, and then chapter 1, right? Early Americans. And we flip through that maybe 1.5 chapters, and it says something along the lines of, the Indians came here from Siberia over the land bridge, and then they spread out all over the place, and they became different tribes. Maybe you learn about the Iroquois, and the Cherokee, and the Lakota, or the Navajo, or the Pueblo, right? Depends on where you're at. And then all these tribes, they were doing stuff, and they were growing corn, and they were hunting deers and things like that. And then the colonists came, right? And they had their first Thanksgiving, something, the Revolution, right? And then from that point on, the history book tells a very different story, right? The last mention that you might get of Native people in a history book is around the 1830s to 1860s with Indian removal and the Indian Wars, right? Maybe if you had a really cool teacher, you get a mention about Navajo code talkers in World War II. Does that sound about right? Okay. And if you don't take an Indian studies course in college, right, you're probably not going to learn anything beyond that. So when we talk about the way that people sort of engage with or not engage with Native people here in the United States, coming and sitting down and talking with someone like myself or Cody or Chris or Martin, this might be the very first time in somebody's life that they know that they're talking to a Native person. And a really cool, I don't know if I want to say cool, but a really interesting sort of fact is that it might be the very last time, right? So when you think about how that works then, you think about people's sort of initial reactions, the way that people interact today might have been different in ways that you might not expect from how things work here in the 18th century in Williamsburg, right? So, here in this city in the 18th century, in 1763, Thomas Jefferson writes in his journal while he's studying law here in Williamsburg. He makes a note, he says, Not a day goes by here that I do not see these people. Some so liken unto us that they are only distinguishable by their tattoos and hairstyles, and some dress in the oddest fashions of their own nations, right? So everywhere you go here in the city, from the Capitol to the college, to the palace, to the taverns, to the courthouse, to the coffee house, to the merchant houses and shops and things like that, the local farms and taverns, you're going to find either members of local tribes like Pamunkey and Monacan and Nottoway and Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Nansemond, Rappahannock, or foreign nations who are coming here to the capital to do political business. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Yuchi, Catawba, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Six Nations. All of these people are going to be coming and going through Williamsburg. It's a pretty constant fixture of the city, right? Not a day goes by that I do not see these people. How many of you that's true today? So we're going to explore a little bit of why, right? So as we're kind of coming up through the 18th century, up to the point of the Revolution, there are some very interesting changes that are beginning to happen. Not only legally, right? We talk about the Revolution. It's not only a legal revolution in that you're changing the sort of legal yoke and identity of this country. You're also changing the culture and the environment that goes along with that. And so here in Williamsburg, to kind of juxtapose, one of the most common questions that we get is, what was the relationship between the colonists and the Indians, right? Pretty standard, pretty common, right? Nothing wrong with that question. The only thing is, we would ask a little bit of a change of perspective, right? Colonists and the Indians and the colonists, the Colonials and the Native Americans, cowboys and Indians. That's what that question is, right? What's the relationship between the cowboys and the Indians, between the colonists and the Indians, between the settlers and the Native Americans, right? Between us and them and they and that and us and those people and all these other kind of things like that, right? That's a very common way for people to interact. And so when we think about how that functions then, my question to people who ask that question is always, who are you talking about, right? When you say colonists, do you mean English, Irish, French, Dutch, Scottish, German, Welsh, Italian, Spanish, right? When you say Indians, do you mean Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, Yuchi, Catawba, Wyandotte, Seneca, Cayuga, Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Tuscarora, Mattaponi, Chickahominy, Nansemond, Rappahannock, Chesapeake, Paspahegh, Wayanoks, Innos, Tutelos, Occaneechees, Saponis, Navajos, right? Apaches, Comanches, Kiowas. Who are you talking about? When you say black or African or enslaved, are you talking about Xhosa or Igbo or Mandi or Maasai or Zulu or Akombe or Ethiopian? Who are you talking about? And so when we start talking about the concept of identity and how that applies in people's interactions, the way that we do things today is a little different from the way it was in the 18th century, right? And so as we're kind of walking around and exploring, Thomas Jefferson says, not a day goes by that I do not see these people. Some, so liken unto us that they are only distinguishable by their tattoos and hairstyles, and some dressed in the oddest fashions of their own nations. There's a little bit of a hidden distinction there, right? So, relationship between the colonists and the Indians. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So here in Williamsburg, tributary tribes like Pamunkey, Mattaponi, Nottoway, Monacan, Saponi, here's how they interact with Williamsburg, right? They live on land grants, which are small parcels of land that are royally protected, that are set aside by the king, right? You live here, you work here, you do everything here. You can't do anything outside of this. So you live on land grants, you can't live anywhere outside of that. You can't leave the colony of Virginia, can't travel in groups more than 3, can't travel with weapons, can't enter government buildings, can't speak for yourself in court, can't testify against any white person, can't own property, can't vote, can't hold any elected office, can't participate to any great degree in Church of England. Let's see here. Can't leave the colony of Virginia. I think I already said that one. And you're not allowed to have any contact with nations separate of England, right? So, to contrast that, let's say here in the very same city at the very same time, 4 Shawnee men who are living in the governor's palace. 2 of them lived there for about 9 months, right? They are staying there as royal guests of Lord Dunmore after his war out in the Ohio Valley, right? Hostages to ensure good relations. 4 English officers are staying in Scioto, and 4 Shawnee men are staying here in Williamsburg. These men are treated as visiting royalty. They're wined and dined, taken to theater plays and parties and balls and dinners and given gifts and driven around in the governor's personal carriage, and they're taken on tours to see the ships and ports down at Norfolk. They're taken honored guest at Lady Dunmore's ball in January for the birthnight of Queen Charlotte and the christening of Lady Virginia. They dance there alongside the governor and his family and give a short speech while they're there. And those Pamunkey folks at the very same time, the very same city, just outside the palace, can't enter the palace, can't even step foot in there. Can't go into the courthouse. They can't testify against any white person. They can't own property or vote. 52% of Williamsburg is enslaved African folks. And so that sort of juxtaposition, when you talk about kind of how things are working here, there are people today, when you talk about the concept of Indians, right? These Pamunkey folks are equally as Indian as these Shawnee folks, right? There's no distinction that people would make between them when you start talking about kind of how folks view and kind of function in the modern world. They're both Indians. What type of Indian are you, right? That's a very common question for us to hear. What kind of Indian are you? What type of Indian are you? How much Indian are you, right? And so when we start getting into those conversations, there's a very distinct and clear line as to how we view ourselves and how we represent ourselves and how Americans view us and represent us in their own minds and media and things like that, right? So as we come up to the 18th century and into the Revolution, there are two kind of very distinct branches that form off of this tree of how European folks begin to sort of identify Native people. One is seems like a very positive branch, so the noble savage, right? The idea that these Indians, they are inherently good and kind, and giving and generous, and they're teaching us how to grow corn with fish heads, and they're giving us all these things, and they talk to raccoons and jump off waterfalls and all that kind of stuff, right? And on the other side, there's a whole nother concept that exists. The brutal savage, the idea that these Indians, they're always at war with each other, and they're always at war with us, and they're always fighting and going out and doing this thing, and they're constantly dressed up for war. They've got their tomahawks and war paint, and they're attacking the frontier and all these other kinds of things like that. But they're holistically separate conversations. And so when we start talking about these things, to use historic quotes for both of these, for the noble savage, the naturals of this continent live as Adam and Eve before the fall of man, having no shame in the corporal form in which they've been placed on this earth, and are free from the vices of the old world. Right? And on this side, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, he says, "The merciless Indian savage whose only known rule of warfare is the indiscriminate destruction of all ages, races, and stations." It's pretty clear. Very separate, very sort of polarized ideas, right? These things exist side by side at the same time. So when you say, like, they're a product of their time, these people are equally products of their time, and they share diametrically opposed opinions, right? So when we start talking about these concepts and how European people begin to talk about and represent Native folks separate of our influence, just in their own minds and media, you have one that's very seemingly positive and one that's very seemingly negative. However, I would posit that they both do the same thing, right? So inherently good and kind and giving and generous and brotherly and etc., right? Free from the vices of the old world. Why are they free from the vices of the old world? Old world meaning Europe, right? Why? Why are they free from those vices? What makes them any different? Any guesses? What do you think? Weren't exposed to those things? Could be. So let's look at it this way, right? He said they live as Adam and Eve before the fall of man. What was the fall of man? What was the event that he's talking about? What? The original sin. What was the original sin? What's that? Eating from the tree of knowledge. The knowledge of what? Knowledge of good and evil, right? And so they live as Adam and Eve before the fall of man, free from the vices of the old world. What he's saying is that these people have no knowledge of good and evil, right? And so the concept, the sermon that goes around that, the sermon that comes from, is a sermon about the concept of shame. And it's basically talking about how useful shame is to a civilized society. And he's remarking that these Indian folks have no shame. They have no shame for their bodies. They have no shame for their actions, and etc., and so they are impossible to control. And then he makes a distinction and says that a healthy dose of shame within civilized society keeps people in order. Very similar to the Treatises of Two Government, John Locke and Robert Fermer. And so, inherently good or inherently bad, right? Generosity and kindness and brotherhood and compassion, what are all these characteristics of? Benches or trees or birds? People. Now what about vice and violence and greed and jealousy and war? People, right? So what happens if you wipe any of those things from a story? Does it become more or less human? I'd say less, right? So to say that the Indians are inherently good or inherently bad, right, is in its own way dehumanizing. And you get to a point in that kind of pull back and forth, this sort of tug of war that goes back and forth, gets to a point that the humanity is completely wiped from this picture, right? And at that point, you can do anything you want with it. You can mold that into anything that you want, right? So cowboys and Indians can be anything. You can put anything you want on either side of that story because there's no human value in those things. They are ideas. They are scales that you can weigh anything on. And so as we kind of come up past the revolution, there's a very distinct change in language that leads kind of in a roundabout way to the modern world we live in. So the treaties and laws and identities of these folks, right? Not a day goes by that I do not see these people. Treaty of Whitehall, 1722, the Articles of Friendship and Commerce with the Cherokee Nation. The Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokee Nation. The Treaty of Pennsylvania with the Six Nations. The Treaty of Niagara with the Six Nations and Shawnee. The Treaty of Easton with the Seneca, with the Six Nations, Shawnee and Delaware. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Six Nations. The Treaty of Camp Charlotte with the Shawnee and other Ohio country tribes. The Treaty of Greenville with the Miami and such. These are all English treaties, right? And note how specific they are. The treaty of this place with this country, this place with this country, this place with this country. 1819, Indian Civilization Act. 1830, the Indian Removal Act. 1867, the Indian Act, the Indian Education Act, the Indian Relocation Act, the Indian Family Planning and Population Act, the Indian Citizenship Act, the Indian Voting Rights Act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Act, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? Notice a change? Does anybody know how many tribes are in the United States right now, 2021? Not a day goes by that I do not see these people. Take a guess. Shout me out some numbers.
75.
75.
430.
430. 600. 75. This is a really strange auction. There are 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States today. It's about 380 distinct, unique native languages spoken fluently here in the U.S. today. It's about 450 distinct religions practiced amongst different tribes today, right? Native religions, not introduced ones. So when we start talking about those ideas and we start talking about that identity, for myself as a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, what that means is not that I am a descendant of the Shawnee tribe. I am a citizen of this tribal nation that still has maintained its existence up to the modern day, that functions as its own government. We have our own constitution. We have our own laws. We're a domestic sovereign nation within the United States. And I have a dual citizenship to my own country and the United States, right? That's what that means. Six Nations in the 18th century controls about the same size territory as modern-day France. Cherokee Nation is about twice the size of England, right? So when people think about tribes, when we portray tribes, when we talk about tribes, most of the time it's this sort of very loose, sort of almost like a club, right? So these people are kind of loosely organized together and they have similar values, or maybe their hair is the same, or maybe they like the same type of shoes. That's what makes them a tribe, right? But we don't think about these people as countries. We don't think about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people organized under distinct government systems that have their own unique religions and languages and cultures that persist into the modern day. And that's really the big kicker, right? If I were to bet you $100, I don't have $100, but if I had $100, right, and I was going to give you this $100, I told you to pick out any textbook that that was guaranteed to talk about Native Americans, which textbook would you reach for? History? Same $100, right? I want you to go pick me out any movie that guarantees talks about Native Americans. What genre of movie are you going for? Western. I'm going to bet you $100 you can go into any library and pick me out a book that guaranteed talks about Native Americans. What section are you going for? Anthropology. So pull out your phone and Google Native American. First whole page, I bet, is going to be nothing but black and whites, oil paintings, and that kind of stuff, right? Manifest Destiny Angel, those things, right? I was just home in Oklahoma on the reservation at our green corn, and everybody was in color. Nobody was in black and white, right? And so when we think about and talk about Native folks here in the United States, it is always the Indians lived, the Indians ate, the Indians hunted, the Indians fished, the Indians grew, the Indians built, the Indians fought, the Indians were, right? As a past tense sort of conversation. Nobody carries that up into the modern day and talks about Native people today living as modern people, still speaking our languages. I don't even know this. Cell phones work in languages other than English, right? And so I can call, what in the world? I can call my family back home and have conversations in Shawnee. I can get on Zoom and attend our language classes. I can do all of these modern things. I can listen to our socials dance songs in the car, right? And so I can have pizza for dinner, or I could have skibakia. I can have our traditional foods and things like that, right? That's the kind of thing that we live with today in the modern world. So that was just a little bit of some background about these things, and just to get you thinking about the way that we have conversations, the things that we might take for granted. So we got about 10 minutes left. What kind of questions are you interested in? What kind of things might you want to know more about? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me know if I am saying this correctly. So there are 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States today. So how many tribes are there that don't have federal recognition? Well, so to explain a little bit about what federal recognition is real quick. Federal recognition is a process through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, usually, that is basically a checklist. And it says you have these things that qualifies you to be recognized as a domestic sovereign nation that Congress will interact with as a domestic sovereign nation, right? So you have to have a distinct language, distinct culture, distinct and documentable history and religious practice, a connection to the United States or other colonial nation that goes back longer than 100 years, population, records as far back as you can trace records of population, and some other things, right? So 576 tribal nations in the United States today met those qualifications. Some are still applying, obviously, for federal recognition. It's an ongoing process. But what that does is it is a international sort of statement that's made and says, these people, Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, the Eastern Band of Cherokee, the Eastern Shawnee Tribe of Oklahoma, the Seneca Cayuga Nation, the Delaware Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma. These are federally recognized tribes. We recognize these countries as equal to the United States, that we do business with, that we uphold treaties with, that we interact with as a government-to-government body, right? There are state-recognized tribes. I am not sure how that started, but with the Indian Commerce Clause in the Constitution, only Congress is supposed to have the ability to publicly recognize tribal nations. I don't know how state recognition got started. It comes with very, very limited sort of abilities within the state and local area. And it usually happens in the modern day through a petition of voters, right? The problem is, when we start talking about recognition, there's a very blurry conversation that surrounds it, especially when you throw in the concept of fraudulent tribes. So, in the absence, or the perceived, and I'll throw that out there, the perceived absence of native people, especially east of the Mississippi River, that absence creates a sort of novelty, right? How do I say this? People will capitalize on that novelty any way they possibly can, right? So, there are 39 fake Shawnee tribes in Ohio. How do I define that? What makes them fake, right? Obviously, well, there had to have been some Shawnee people left behind, right? Documentably, we can say no, there were not, right? We have very clear records about who is coming from the Ohio Valley down into Oklahoma. And even, let's say, devil's advocate, that story is true, that you were left behind. Your citizenship is severed at that point, right? And so that's kind of the thing, right? Heritage and citizenship are two vastly different things. You can have Indian blood, and you can not be a citizen, or you can be a citizen and not have native blood. Those two things are not synonymous, right? And so when we talk about that identity here in the United States, there are a lot of unrecognized tribes. Some of them are legitimate folks that don't have the resources to go through the process. Some of them are probably not legitimate, and there's probably a good portion of them that are just mixed bags, right? Of native folks, non-native folks who have just all kind of come together in this common identity of, I know that I have Indian ancestry, right? And so these sort of social clubs that form out of that concept, let's say, for instance, I'm going to use Shawnee as an example because that's where I'm from and that's what I'm most familiar with. On our most recent visit to Ohio, at Serpent Mound, there was a group, and they called themselves the Piqua Council Fire Remnant Band of Shawnee, Ohio. Very long name. And they were demanding to be involved in the Indian Child Welfare process. For those of you who aren't aware, Indian Child Welfare Act is put in place to protect Native kids in the welfare system, specifically because even though we make up 1.6% of the U.S. population, we account for almost half of the FBI's missing or murdered cases. So 1.6% of the population, guess what the statistic is for us to be missing or be murdered? Take a guess. Give me out a number. In the form of times. 48 times? 48 times the national average? 12 times the national average to be murdered, 16 times the national average to go missing. 1.6% of the U.S. population. If I would have told you twice the national average, that would have been an alarming statistic. 16 times. 96% of Native women are assaulted in their lifetimes. 84% of Native men are, right? 75% of all police reports taken around these incidents include racial slurs. So when we talk about things like the Indian Child Welfare Act, that is specifically put in place as a pipeline for Native children to remain within Native communities to protect culture, language, and those kids from being trafficked, right? This group in Ohio that had no federal status whatsoever was demanding to be included in a federal law that pipeline Native children directly to them. That's insanely dangerous. We don't know who these people are. We don't know who they're connected to. They're very close to a border, right? But they were demanding, and they had the governor's attention because he dare not question what they say their heritage is, right? That's why it's important to have these legal distinctions between heritage and citizenship be well understood, because now there's a binary yes or no question that can be answered to determine who is involved in these processes and who is not, right? That's the example that I like to bring up, and so when we talk about the Indian identity today, you have Native folks who are legitimate, who are enrolled or not enrolled, who are still legitimate, don't speak their language, don't practice their religion, don't participate within their culture, and you have people who are exactly the binary opposite, who may or may not be enrolled, but speak fluent Cherokee or speak fluent Navajo or speak fluent Shawnee, etc., that were there at Greencorn every single year, that are there at Sundance every single year, and people know them, they trust them, and they're part of that community. And so our traditional concepts of how we determine who is or is not a citizen within our nation are kind of juxtaposed to the United States in that we don't require race as a qualification, and the U.S. does. And so as we kind of move up into the modern day, more and more Native folks on social media, more and more Native people getting resources to be able to portray ourselves, our own TV shows, our own movies, our own images and things like that for the very first time, people are beginning to see a very different story and are wondering, why have I never seen this before, right? That's one of the other common questions is people ask, like, why have I never heard this before, right? So how many of you know about like boarding schools? How many of you heard something about that recently? Does anybody know when the last boarding school closed down here in the U.S.?
1970?
1996. So my dad, he went to Riverside Indian Boarding School, and my mom went to Seneca Indian Boarding School. So I'm the first person in my immediate family that did not go to an Indian boarding school, right? So when we talk about that conversation, again, the kind of distorted view of history, what do we always see when we think about boarding schools? We see those black and white pictures of all those kids standing out there in front of these 1800 schools in their uniforms and things like that, right? We don't see any color pictures. We don't see any modern, up-to-date stuff, you know. And so when we talk about, like, say, like sterilization, Indian Family Planning and Population Act, I mentioned that one earlier, 1988. That sterilized about a quarter of the native population of the U.S. without their consent or against their will, didn't matter. 1988. And so people remember what they were doing when the Twin Towers fell, right? I know people that can tell me what kind of donut they were eating and what part of the highway they were on when they heard it on the radio, right? When I was just back home at Sundance, there was a reminder given that this is not the traditional time of year for our green corn and Sundance. It's usually later in the fall. But we're now having conversations about moving it back to that time of year because previously, up to the point that I was born, we couldn't have it in the fall because all the boys were off at boarding school. And you weren't going to see those kids again until they're 18 years old, right? So these things are very, very recent and ongoing. As we talk about colonization or colonial, right? People say colonial, they mean 1700s, but colonial is a mindset. And so as we kind of move into the modern world, right, there are a lot of people who are making decisions, who are having conversations, who are creating stories and are writing scripts and things like that about Native people that have never laid eyes on a Native person in their life, right? As we kind of come up, well, there's my cue. And so as we kind of come up into the modern world, as a Native person, I like history. I like studying history. I like being here at Williamsburg and talking about the 18th century and kind of how we got to this point. But the goal of it for me is that I don't live in the 18th century. I live now, right? I live in the 21st century. I like to drive my car. I like to eat pizza. I like to watch YouTube and things like that. But I also like being a part of my community, and I like the opportunities that my parents did not have to go to a school where all kinds of people, to go home and be able to speak as much of my language as I could possibly learn, and to do the things that 20 years ago were not a possibility for my family, right? Imagine what we could do 20 years from now for my kids. How fluent are they going to be? Or people who never met Native folks in their lives get into these positions of power. How close are we to going back to boarding schools? That's the question. That's kind of when we talk about representation, why it matters, right? Some folks think of racism as kind of like an offense or hurt feelings. When I think of racism, I think about those statistics. Third leading cause of death for Native folks is murder. Boarding schools closed down the year I was born. My mom and my dad went to those schools, right? People were sterilized. A quarter of the Native population was sterilized, right? That's what I think of when I think of that word, not hurt feelings. And so those are the things that I always encourage people to think about. If you've never met a Native person before in your life, you don't have to raise your hand for that one. and you may never meet a Native person again, at least you can say now that you knew better. Right? And so that's the only thing that we can ever ask for. But I thank y'all for coming out and listening today. I thank y'all for listening to me ramble for, 45 minutes or so. I hope to see you again at some of our other programs. And if you have any more questions or curiosities or things that you would want to know more about, you can always come and find myself, Martin, Cody, or Chris at the encampment site or over at the palace. So, thank y'all.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.